More international stories for you now. The Western warnings are circling over Syria's chemical weapons, but nearby Israel has another worry on its mind, and the arsenal could get in the hands of Hezbollah. Well, for Israel, such arms being controlled by what it considers to be a terrorist group would be a red line. Well, the country's agents are said to be operating in Syria to track and possibly sabotage stocks. Well, live now to Marcus Papadopoulos, editor of Politics First magazine. He joins us from London. Thank you for joining us here on RT. How real is the threat of chemical weapons ending up in the hands of militants or terror groups, do you think?
Well, of course, in the event of the Syrian army suffering a setback in those regions of Syria where the chemical weapons are stored, then yes, there's a very strong possibility that the Syrian militants could very well acquire chemical weapons, which of course would be catastrophic, not just for Syria, but for the entire region. It might be an inconvenient truth to many Western politicians and Western journalists, but of course the Islamists in Syria, who are largely representative of the militants, they wouldn't hesitate to use them against Syria's minorities, be it the Alawites, the Christians or the Druze or indeed even the Kurds, and they certainly wouldn't hesitate to use them against Israel. So that's why it's so very important to stop the constant flow of weapons and cash into Syria by certain Western states and Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar.
You mentioned Israel there, and recently there have been several red line warnings coming from Israel to Hezbollah, Syria and Iran. What could be behind this war rhetoric?
Well, of course, Israel has a legitimate concern, and rightly so. When it warns about chemical weapons falling into the wrong hands, of course, they're meaning overwhelmingly the militants in Syria. The Israelis, they're not concerned that the Syrian government would use chemical weapons against Israel, but they are very concerned that the militants in Syria would use them if they acquired them. And that's why, if the West is not going to listen to the Syrian government, then it certainly should listen to the concerns of Israel.
Well, talking about the West, I mean, the US and its allies are adamant that Assad must go. Wouldn't removing the Syrian government, though, increase the chances of chemical weapons perhaps ending up in the wrong hands?
Well, of course, President Assad being removed from power is not a policy. It's an emotional statement. It's an emotional statement that Western countries have been putting out for the last almost 2 years. Should President Assad and his government fall from power, the whole infrastructure of Syria would collapse. When a government falls from power in wartime, everything collapses, society collapses, and in the event of that happening, then once again, yes, there's a very realistic possibility that the militants in Syria could acquire chemical weapons. And of course, who would be responsible for that? It would be those countries around the world, in particular in the region, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and certain Western countries that are doing absolutely everything they can at the moment to weaken the Syrian government.
And this talk of a chemical threat, is that an excuse for military intervention?
Well, of course, the West's interest in the conflict in Syria isn't guided by democracy, rule of law. It's guided by geostrategic objectives. If it was concerned by human rights and democracy, then the West would not have such a close relationship to Saudi Arabia, which arguably has the most repressive, wicked system in the world. But I think, yes, we should be on guard. It could be a pretext that what the West is using, principally America, to intervene in Syria. I still think Western military intervention is probably not going to happen, but we should be on guard. Of course, they did it in Kosovo, where they claimed 100,000 Kosovan Albanians being murdered by Serb forces. That never happened. They claimed it in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, the reason for going in. Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Nothing was found. Intervening in Libya, Colonel Gaddafi's forces, we were told, were going to slaughter thousands and thousands of Libyan civilians. There was never any evidence for that. So, yes, it could be a pretext, but I think we should still be cautious that the West is probably not going to militarily intervene in Syria.
OK, we'll leave it there. Marcus Papadopoulos, editor of Politics First magazine. Thank you.
Thank you.